and reaction being equal and opposite, but he would never dream of evoking the unbalance or cliphotic aspect by itself or by its own sake, that being too risky an operation. For practical purposes, when elemental forces are handled, they are dealt with in their sublimated forms. Skemet, the lion-headed fire goddess, for instance, being a preferable form to Kali. These crude forms of force, however, have to be understood by the occultist, or he will have trouble with them. Anybody who makes a serious study of occultism has got to understand these things, and people are not to be branded as black because they study them. In fact, they would be very superficial students if they did not. But anyone who makes a public exhibition or popular exposition of black magic most certainly stands condemned, for it is not necessary that anyone save specialists should be acquainted with these things, and it is better for the general run of mankind to leave them alone, for to dwell upon them tends to put one in touch with them, and unless one takes the precautions that the initiate takes when dealing with them, one is liable to infection. The middle pillar does to people, or the stoicism that is possible in the endurance of pain, or how, if you're lucky, you may die with dignity, to see how corrosive the effects of jealousy can be, or how power corrupts or does not corrupt. For such knowledge and such understanding of the human species, don't look in my textbook of psychology. Try Lear and Othello and Hamlet. As a supplement to William James, read Henry James and Jane Austen and Mark Twain. These people are telling us things that are not on science's program. End quote. Not only is modern clinical psychology detached from the humanities, it is divorced from spirituality. Throughout history, humans have forfeited tranquility, comfort, and sometimes life itself for spiritual motives. Spirituality is important to our health and well-being. It is so much a part of us that trying to understand human beings without it is like trying to study fish and omitting the fact that they live in water. Unfortunately, many psychotherapists have done just that, persuading themselves and their clients to believe that the spiritual portion of them either does not exist or is irrelevant. Psychology and spirituality should not be separate entities. It is time to tear down the artificial walls that define them. The various schools of magic and their extensive teachings comprise an enormous body of wisdom that was the forerunner of modern psychology. The ancient art of magic can give back to the modern science of psychology that which it has so unwisely neglected, a systematic practice for addressing the spiritual factor in humans in a manner that is in accord with modern psychological principles. One of psychology's founding fathers, Carl Gustav Jung, was aware of this even if some of today's psychotherapists have forgotten it. A sign hanging above Jung's office door read, Avocatus atque non avocatus Deus aderet. Whether or not he is called, God will be present. Since the goal of both magic and psychotherapy is the well-being of the individual, it is only natural they become reacquainted with one another. Contemporary psychology must transform itself to include a more holistic approach, wherein the physical, psychological, and transpersonal aspects of the individual are all seen as interconnected, and humanity's need for healing, spirituality, and guidance is respected. If psychology can be compared to a dictionary of words in a specific language, the human psyche, magic can be compared to a book of poetry that makes those words come alive with meaning and relevance in our lives, psychological/spiritual evolution. Now that we have reprimanded modern psychology for its shortcomings, we can explore some of the monumental contributions it has made to the understanding of the human mind. From there, we will explore how psychotherapy and magic can come together to the meaningful enrichment of both, and more importantly, for the benefit and welfare of the individual. Psychotherapy. Psychotherapy is the treatment of mental disorders with methods that revolve around the interpersonal relationship between therapist and client. A large portion of this entails helping clients explore their own ideas about themselves. The earliest form of psychotherapy, called psychoanalysis, began with Austrian psychologist Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939. Freud discovered that the corporeal systems of patients suffering from hysteria often disappeared after seemingly forgotten material was brought into the realm of consciousness. From this, Freud conjectured one of the most fundamental theories of modern psychology, that within the human psyche there exists a powerful segment known as the unconscious, which influences all of our actions, yet functions with material or content that cannot be recalled or remembered by normal processes. He regarded the unconscious as an extensive portion of the mind that housed instinctual drives and the forgotten residue of unwanted life experiences or thoughts. Freud named this forgetting, or the prevention of undesired ideas from entering the conscious mind, repression. Repression is one of a number of defense mechanisms, unconscious reactions employed to satisfy emotional needs, balance opposing objectives, decrease anxiety resulting from unwanted thoughts, or change reality to make it more bearable. The cornerstone of Freud's psychoanalytic therapy was the conscious recollection or recognition of repressed memories and experiences. The basic tools of this therapy were free association and dream interpretation. In recent years, other forms of psychotherapy, including behavior therapy, hypnotherapy, and group therapy, have become popular. In many cases, psychotherapy is not only employed for the treatment of mental disorders, but for less severe problems. Therapists often assist people in breaking unwanted or compulsive habits, smoking, overeating, etc. Freud's triad of the psyche. Freud developed the theory that the conscious mind is only a small part of our mental composition, and our motivations are caused, for the most part, by factors that we are unaware of. Freud postulated that psyche is divided into three distinct factions: the id, the ego, and the superego. According to Freud, the id is the division of the psyche that is completely unconscious and functions as the origin of instinctual impulses and demands for instant satisfaction of primal needs. It is the reservoir of unconscious drives ruled by the pleasure principle and instant gratification. The ego is that portion of the psyche which is conscious, most directly governs thought and behavior, and is most concerned with outer reality. The ego mediates between the id, the superego, and the stipulations of reality or society. The superego, primarily unconscious, is that which is created by the internalization of moral standards from parents and society. It is the conscious and the ego ideal, the moralizing faculty which monitors and censors the ego. Because of society, parental guidance, and peer pressure, humans experience a process of repression from the day of birth. Thus, the id and the superego are usually in conflict in most people, since, as Freud thought, repression was necessary in order for humanity to live within the bounds of civilization. Human beings, according to Freud, are motivated by vital animal instincts, primarily the sexual drive, which he called the libido. Other principal elements of psychology uncovered by Freud were the ideas of the Oedipus complex and infantile sexuality. Freud's tools for exploring the human psyche included the hypnosis, dream analysis, and a new technique that he termed free association. The goal of Freudian analysis was to release repressed memories and provide an increase in self-knowledge that would release trapped energies and result in a more satisfying existence for the patient. Jung and spiritual psychology. The works of Swiss psychologist C.G. Jung, 1875 to 1961, can be seen as part of the apex of the occult revival of the late 19th century. Using the new vocabulary employed by Sigmund Freud, Jung described that knowledge of the human psyche which mystics and magicians had gathered since ancient times. What had once been veiled in occult jargon and symbolism, and thus viewed as superstition and nonsense by the public at large, was now for the first time expressed in such a manner that psychologists and other intellectuals sat up and took notice. Jung's exploration of psychology in conjunction with his study of the paranormal made his theories the crucial link between psychology and magic. However, his interest in occult matters was one of the primary reasons for his ultimate break with Freud. The difference between Freud's and Jung's approaches to psychology was primarily Jung's view that the human psyche was a whole organism, and Freud's belief that it was not. Freud extrapolated a rather disorderly picture of the psyche, wherein autonomous components of the mind battled for dominance. Jung saw the psyche as being complete in itself from birth. The various elements of the psyche attempted to work harmoniously together, and their natural inclination was toward unity. While both men recognized two basic halves of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, Jung further divided the unconscious into two levels, personal and collective. In addition, Freud was more concerned with his patient's past, while Jung emphasized the patient's future development. Whereas Freud referred to his method as psychoanalysis, Jung preferred the phrase analytical psychology. Heilsweg. The psychology which Jung very gradually developed was described by him as Heilsweg, a German word which meant sacred way and a method of healing. Jung's idea of the psyche was based on a separation between the conscious and the unconscious, the personal unconscious being a small tributary of the greater river of the collective unconscious. The pilgrimage of the self symbolized the bringing of unconscious content into the light of consciousness. Heilsweg was a method for differentiating the self from the collective unconscious that was the blueprint of individual existence. It was a way of individuation, or the process by which a person becomes self-realized, a separate indivisible unity or whole which contains all aspects of the self. This was a radical departure from Freud's view that people are enslaved to the drives of the id and superego, which pressure them into conforming with society-sanctioned patterns of behavior. According to Jung, the ego's formation of an identity was not only the beginning of true personhood, but also the commencement of a natural polarity between the general and the specific. Several stages marked the process of Heilsweg, or individuation. The first step was the confrontation with the shadow, those unconscious aspects of the mind which have been buried or ignored by the conscious mind. This begins with the dissolution of the false self, the mask, or the outer persona. Quote, the persona is a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. Fittingly enough, a kind of mask designed on the one hand to make a definite impression upon others, and on the other hand, to conceal the true nature of the individual. End quote. Next, the individual encounters his soul image, the anima, or the animus. The final step is the manifestation in dreams, visions, or fantasies of appropriate archetypes, primordial images such as the wise old man or the great mother, images that appear as themes in religion, mythology, and folklore. The process of individuation contains many particular aspects which collectively might be termed outer psychology. This category includes Jung's separation of introverted and extroverted personality types, as well as his organization of types in accordance with their conjunction of the faculties of sensing, thinking, feeling, and intuition. All of Jung's ideas were of vital importance to modern understanding of the human psyche. However, the most notable contribution of Jungian psychology was the concept that individuation was a spiritual excursion, and it is highly significant that this pioneer of psychology phrased his ideas in spiritual terms. Thus, it is no surprise to find that Jung's system complements the mystical Kabbalah in so many ways. The nature of the psyche. Jung's definition of the psyche included not only that which we call the soul, but also the intellect, the spirit, and the totality of all psychic processes. The psyche is as real as the body is real. All psychic phenomena are real, since the psyche is indistinguishable from its manifestations. The psyche expresses itself in images that are full of meaning and purpose. It creates reality every day. It has its own peculiar structure and form. Quote, "For the psyche as it presents itself, as it is experienced by us, is inseparable from our physical being. But this by no means implies a biological dependency. The psyche deserves to be taken as a phenomenon in its own right. There are no grounds at all for regarding it as a mere epiphenomenon, dependent though it may be on the functioning of the brain. One would be as little justified in regarding life as an epiphenomenon of the chemistry of carbon compounds." End quote. The psyche consists of many parts, but there are two primary divisions that are interrelated: consciousness and unconsciousness. Unconsciousness. The unconscious is not simply the absence of consciousness. It is the division of the mind containing elements of psychic makeup, such as memories or repressed desires, that are not subject to conscious perception or control, but that often affect conscious thoughts and behavior. The personal unconscious is that unknown part of the individual human mind that is older than the conscious part of the mind. It is the primal portion from which consciousness arises. This unconscious, equivalent to Freud's superego, is unique to the individual, and it contains suppressed, forgotten, or subliminally perceived contents originating from a person's life. Whereas the mind can be trained, the unconscious cannot. It is a creative and autonomous psychic entity that is beyond subjective control. Jung concluded that the collective unconscious does not include personal characteristics distinctive to one's individual ego, but rather the sum of what is inherited from the biological and psychic structure common to the human race. They are those acts and mental patterns that are universally shared by all humanity. The primordial images of the collective unconscious are the result of thousands of years of human struggle and experience. Quote, "Every great experience in life, every profound conflict, evokes the accumulated treasure of these images and brings about their inner constellation. But they become accessible to consciousness only when the individual possesses so much self-awareness and power of understanding that he also reflects on what he experiences instead of just living it blindly. In the later event, he actually lives the myth and the symbol without knowing it." End quote. Consciousness. Consciousness is that component of waking awareness perceptible to a person at any given instant. It is a state of being mentally awake and observant, of having an awareness of one's environment and one's own existence, sensations, and thoughts. Consciousness is therefore the function which sustains the relationship between psychic content and the ego. Many mistake consciousness with mere thinking, when consciousness actually includes feeling, will, fantasy, and all other facets of waking life. Sentience is one of humanity's defining attributes, as stated by Jung. Quote, "Man's capacity for consciousness alone makes him man." End quote. Elsewhere, Jung states, quote, "And yet the attainment of consciousness was the most precious fruit of the tree of knowledge, the magical weapon which gave man victory over the earth, and which we hope will give him a still greater victory over himself." End quote. Jung believed that the most important objective for any individual was the attainment of harmony between the two halves of the psyche, the conscious and the unconscious. In this manner, man would achieve the, quote, "greater victory over himself." End quote. The shadow. Quote, "If the repressed tendencies, the shadow as I call them, were obviously evil, there would be no problem whatsoever. But the shadow is merely somewhat inferior, primitive, unadapted, and awkward, not wholly bad. It even contains childish or primitive qualities which would, in a way, vitalize and embellish human existence." End quote. The shadow represents the sum of all personal and collective psychic elements which, due to their incompatibility with the selected conscious demeanor, are refused expression in life and consequently unite into a somewhat independent splinter personality, a type of alter ego, whose unconscious inclinations run opposite those of the conscious. It is our dark brother, who is a hidden but undeniable part of our total psyche. The development of the shadow coincides with that of the ego. Aspects that the ego rejects are repressed and have little or no outlet in a person's conscious life. The shadow often behaves to counterbalance the conscious, which can be positive or negative. Very much an archetypal figure, the shadow personality often appears symbolically in dreams as being the same sex as the dreamer. In addition, an individual will sometimes project his shadow, i.e. his own unwanted subconscious characteristics, onto another person. In keeping with his views on the unconscious, Jung proposed that there are actually two forms of the shadow: the personal shadow, composed of the individual's cast-off psychic content, and the collective shadow, which embodies all the collective repressed memories of humankind. By the way, on page 112, there is a figure 5, Jung's model of the psyche, outer world, inside a self, surrounded by ego, and the shadow, The shadow contains animus, anima. The ego contains the persona. On the outside of the circle is collective unconscious and collective conscious. The personal goes in the collective conscious into self, and the unconscious in the collective unconscious also goes towards self in the middle. All right, back to the reading. Confronting the shadow. Quote, everyone carries a shadow, and unless it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. If an inferiority is conscious, one always has a chance to correct it. Furthermore, it is constantly in contact with other interests, so that it is continually subjected to modifications. But if it is repressed and isolated from consciousness, it never gets corrected. End quote. Throughout our lives, we are constantly having to suppress one attribute or another. Thus, the shadow can never completely be assimilated into consciousness. However, it is essential that the most conspicuous aspects of the shadow be raised to consciousness. Instead of rejecting the shadow, its counterpart, the ego will be invigorated by it. If the shadow is not reckoned with, it runs the risk of becoming a vast, dark, forgotten expanse, which blocks one's inner creativity from being fully available to the conscious mind. This is why some people strive with Herculean strain to keep a tight lid on their shadows, concealing their private demons with a thin veneer of moral perfection. The spiritual fortress they construct around themselves is nothing more than a synthetic buttress held in place by force, and ever in danger of structural failure should the wind change direction. Mere suppression of the shadow is as little of a remedy as beheading would be for a headache. It is for this reason that confronting the shadow is the first step in Jung's method of individuation. To do this means taking a starkly critical and objective look into the nature of one's own being. Unconscious content is usually experienced in projection upon something that is outside of us. In the case of unwanted psychic content, some people will readily project their shadow onto someone else. Thus, we have a tendency to shift the blame onto an appropriate scapegoat. The other guy did it. As a comedian once insisted, the devil made me do it. It is extremely difficult for some analysts to accept the fact that they do indeed have a deep, dark side. The therapist, who tries to bring the shadow out into the open, often meets with enormous resistance because the client fears that the artificial structure he has carefully constructed to protect his ego will come crashing down. This is, in fact, the point at which many analyses fail, and the client, incapable of facing his unconscious self, stops the process cold and withdraws into his comfortable old self-deceptions. All of us must face our shadow side. This is especially important for magicians who seek to delve into the inner recesses of the human psyche, the mind of the microcosm. No spiritual progress can be made without it. We must discover the distinct characteristics of our shadow, as opposed to other parts of the psyche, such as the ego, and recognize it for what it is, a natural part of ourselves and nothing to be ashamed of or feel guilty about. Guilt and shame often cause one to repress the shadow in the first place, allowing a small, undesirable trait to grow into a huge, unresolved conflict, compulsion, or neurosis. In some ways, the shadow is like a neglected and resentful child who, if shown kindness and understanding, can learn to play with the other children. Objective understanding of ourselves will make it easier to face the shadow and other parts of the psyche as well. Regression exercise. Examining the events of one's childhood is a prerequisite for determining how the shadow developed. An excellent method for recalling childhood memories is the following regression exercise. Perform the LBRP. Perform the fourfold breath. Breathe in the count of 4. Hold the breath to the count of 4. Exhale to the count of 4. Keep the lungs empty to the count of 4. Sit in a comfortable position or lie down, eyes closed. Spend a few minutes inducing relaxation and rhythmic breathing. Visualize yourself within your present surroundings. As you continue the fourfold breath, see yourself going backwards in time. As you inhale to the count of 4, think of last spring. Hold the breath for 4 counts and think of last winter. Exhale to the count of 4 and imagine last fall. On the empty, hold to the count of 4, think of last summer. Continue the exercise in this fashion, going backwards in time, from spring to winter, fall, and summer, ever backwards, keeping pace with the fourfold breath. You may decide to go back in time in 5-year intervals, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, etc. At any one of these intervals, stop and visualize yourself at that particular point in time. Observe how you looked, how your surroundings looked, the people around you at that time, how you felt about yourself, and how you saw your world. Examine significant events that occurred which shaped your view of the world and of yourself. When ready to end the exercise, use the fourfold breath to visualize time moving forward again. Inhale, spring, full hold, summer. Exhale, fall, empty hold, winter. Move time forward again until you arrive at the present. End the exercise with the LBRP. Always record your observations. You should practice this exercise several times, deciding beforehand what time in the past you wish to examine further. If you become quite proficient in this technique, you can go back 1 year at a time, all the way to birth. Trauma release exercise. Sometimes traumatic experiences or memories are responsible for creating parts of the shadow personality. In such cases, a trauma release exercise can help the analysand let go of the calamitous experience and begin to heal. The technique for this is as follows. Have the person lie on their back. Place your right hand on their forehead and your left hand at the back of their head. A breathing technique to further relaxation is helpful at this point. Next, guide the person to slowly visualize the traumatic event in the reverse order it happened, to a time before it occurred. In other words, emphasize that the details of the event will look like a videotape running in reverse and in slow motion. Then have the person run this mental tape in its natural order, forward in time, until arriving at the initial point when the event began. Guide the person to repeat this backward and forward motion until they no longer feel an emotional connection to the event. At the close of the session, have the person take a long, deep breath as they reflect upon any stress or concerns. Hold the breath for a few seconds and then release it, letting go of any residual tensions. Repeat this process 3 times. It is usually recommended that the person do this exercise a number of times on their own over a period of a few weeks to be certain that it is effective. It can also be done entirely solo, if preferred. Anima and animus. The second step in the process of individuation is defined by the encounter with the animus or the anima. The anima is the embodiment of the reflective feminine nature of man's subconscious, while the animus is the personification of the creative masculine nature of a woman's subconscious. Both are soul images, which usually manifest themselves in anthropomorphic form as fantasy lovers in dream and imagination. Animus and anima have a direct relationship with the persona or mask. If the persona is emotional, the soul image is rational, and vice versa. They are two of the most important archetypes, often influencing how we respond to members of the opposite sex. People often search out and are attracted to someone who symbolizes the attributes of their own psyche. Quote, every man carries within him the eternal image of women, not the image of this or that particular woman, but a definitive feminine image. This image is fundamentally unconscious, an hereditary factor of primordial origin engraved in the living organic system of the man, an imprint or archetype of all the ancestral experiences of the female, a deposit, as it were, of all the impressions ever made by women. Since this image is unconscious, it is always unconsciously projected upon the person of the beloved, and it is one of the chief reasons for passionate attraction or aversion. End quote. We must learn to discriminate between interior and exterior manifestation of the anima and animus, just as we must distinguish ourselves from our shadow. Whereas the conscious recognition of the shadow brings forth the knowledge of one's own dark side, as it relates to a person's own sex, so does the recognition of the animus or anima provide the means for understanding the contrasexual portion of the psyche. It is precisely this lack of discrimination that leads a person to repeatedly seek out a certain kind of mate, a bad boy, or a nasty girl, type who will inevitably treat them poorly. This is exactly how some individuals, in failing to differentiate between their own soul image and secret inner desires and a prospective mate, project the inner image outward and consequently fall into bad relationships time and time again. Sometimes the animus and anima can be symbolized by parental figures, leading some people to try to find a companion who resembles their father or mother in some way. While attempting to find the perfect mate, externalization of the soul image leads some to look outside of themselves for the perfection and beauty that lies within. This is true for most people who choose a mate who represents the subconscious portion of the psyche. And since no human mate can fit perfectly into the transferred image, after time, the carrier of the projection displays his or her own character traits, resulting in frustration and discord in the relationship. If a person could only recognize the soul image within as a part of their own inner self, they would stop attributing their flaws to their mate and retract their projection. Any psychic energy that has been bound up in the projection would be freed for other, more progressive pursuits. The encounter with the soul image usually takes place later in life, after the dynamics of youth, reproduction, and the priorities of the outer world have been satiated. Confronting the soul image is an indication that the second half of one's life has commenced. Once the contrasexual soul image has been brought to consciousness, however, it may not be possible to, quote, lose ourselves completely, end quote, in the love of another, for we have now found the object of that love within us. This brings with it the realization that we are, in fact, complete within ourselves, and we do not need a slavish love to a projected illusion in order to prop us up. Instead, we are enabled to develop a deeper love and a conscious devotion to our partner. The proper role of the soul image is that of the psychopomp, guiding the soul around impasses on its own way towards spiritual transformation. It is the mediator between the conscious and the unconscious. Whereas the persona is the reconciler between the ego and the outer world, the soul image is the reconciler between the ego and the inner world. Once fully realized and integrated, the soul image can bring incredible enrichment into consciousness and a vital expansion of the true self. Archetypes. The third step in the process of individuation is the manifestation of archetypes. An archetype is an idea, mode of thought, or God form that has manifested from the inherited experiences of humankind from the collective unconscious. Quote, the concept of the archetype is derived from the repeated observation that, for instance, the myths and fairy tales of world literature contain definite motifs which crop up everywhere. We meet these same motifs in the fantasies, dreams, deliria, and delusions of individuals living today. These typical images and associations are what I call archetypal ideas. The more vivid they are, the more they will be colored by particularly strong feeling tones. They impress, influence, and fascinate us. They have their origin in the archetype, which in itself is an irrepresentable, unconscious, pre-existent form that seems to be part of the inherited structure of the psyche and can therefore manifest itself spontaneously anywhere at any time. End quote. According to Jung, once the soul image has been integrated, next comes the manifestation of the major archetypes of spirit and matter. These include the wise old man as the spirit principle in man, and the great mother as the principle of matter or nature in women. Here we are dealing with the primal roots of the psyche of either sex back to its origins, and the ancient god forms from which they derive. Both the wise old man and the great mother can appear in a multitude of figures from all world mythologies. They are the sky gods, earth mothers, heroes, heroines, magicians, priests, priestesses, prophetesses, harvest gods, and fertility goddesses of all pantheons. These ancient archetypes are transcendent energies that can bring much wisdom and spiritual growth. Jung referred to archetypal figures of the psyche as mana personalities. This is a particular archetype or group of archetypes that the individual psyche most strongly expresses or manifests. A person who has mana is said to have power and influence over others, but also runs the risk of becoming self-centered and megalomaniacal. This is because these great universal archetypes produce a potent attraction which can, in some instances, entice the individual into identifying him or herself with the archetype, creating a type of self-aggrandizement or ego inflation. Such is the path of many modern-day messiahs, self-appointed gurus, and power-mad spiritual leaders. Quote, an inflated consciousness is always egocentric and conscious of nothing but its own existence. It is incapable of learning from the past, incapable of understanding contemporary events, and incapable of drawing right conclusions about future. It is hypnotized by itself and therefore cannot be argued with. It inevitably dooms itself to calamities that must strike it dead. End quote. All of us surrender to such arrogance during this process of individuation. However, the creative energies that are stimulated in the psyche by the appearance of archetypes can be fully accessed only after one has humbly acquired the ability to discern the difference between him or herself and them. On the road to self-growth, we must not mistake personal insights into our own inner workings as messages from God to his new chosen prophet. We must work to clarify our relationship to spirit and nature as represented by the gods' archetypes. These potent and eternal forces are a part of our psyche that are meant to empower and inspire us. Magicians regard archetypes as various forms or images of divinity that teach us about ourselves and our place in the divine universe. The conscious recognition of the psychic elements that comprise the mana personality archetype brings the first real sense of authentic individuality. Accessing archetypes. Although textbooks on psychology provide few examples of archetypes for the reader to explore, various textbooks on magic are often replete with such prototype figures. Many are readily found in the cards of the tarot. Meditation on these images, as well as a host of tarot exercises that can be found in such books as Madonna Compton's Archetypes on the Tree of Life, Gareth Knight's Tarot and Magic, Paul Foster Case's Book of Tokens, or our own book, The New Golden Dawn Ritual Tarot, can be used to identify and connect with the various archetypes that inhabit the psyche. Several archetypes in the form of gods and goddesses are correlated to the spheres on the Tree of Life, according to their nature and characteristics. War and fire gods are assigned to Gebura, goddesses of love and pleasure to Netzach, etc. A small selection of deities from several pantheons are listed in Chapter 10. Meditation on these figures can aid in understanding the archetypal beings that one may encounter in the process toward true self-awareness. It is important that the student not fall into the trap of the psychologization of magic that is a result of misunderstanding Jung's theories. To the pop psycholo-occultist, the archetypes, deities, and symbols are simply creations of the human mind. They have no existence beyond the individual human being. Pop psychology sometimes gives the impression that humans create, work with, and discard archetypes as easily as an old pair of shoes in a kind of superficial mental role-playing game. This view does not do Jung's theory justice, since archetypes exist eternally and independently of any individual. To truly understand this, one must be willing to accept the spiritual, magical side of human existence. We are part of a cosmic ecosystem, so to speak. Self-realization. Throughout the process of individualization, unconscious content has been gradually raised into